Okay, so we are back to the EKS, and I can see that the EKS, my test cluster, is active status. It's up and running. If I click on it, I can go and check from the console that it's in good state. And there is, if you look at the workloads, you can see that the core DNS is the networking piece. Kubeproxy runs on every node, right? Daemon set, and the AWS node is it's basically local to the AWS as part of the kube system namespace. So you all of these is running perfectly fine. But now if I want to do like a kubectl get nodes and get services, how do I do that? So the next step is to do the update config. Now there's one thing that here is that I created the cluster as a root user, which is not the right thing. So I'm going to and the issue is that root user has access to everything, right? So in a better way, we should create a user with admin access and start allowing access via roles, whatever is needed, not just give everything, because that's a security risk. So but in this case I created as a root user. Now if I go to my and I logged in here, and there I was using the key of a user, a separate user. I created a user, right? If you remember, in my EKS, if you see in my IAM, I created a new user. It was called, what is my user? Yeah, EKS user CLI. So I was using this user, and this user also have admin access, but still it doesn't have a lot of other roles. So this user now, if it tries to, I try to do the update kubeconfig. So this command, basically what it does is it updates the kubeconfig, which is located in the home directory .kube section folder, and it will add my cluster configuration data, so that that way I can access multiple clusters through that kubeconfig file. So after I do that, it updates my kubeconfig, and now I can switch context and I can access my local cluster, the one I set up myself, and I can also access the cluster which I just set up, which is the EKS cluster. But I will not be able to run it if I do kubectl get, let's say, nodes. I am going to get an error, most likely, because I am logged in, yeah, unauthorized, because the cluster is created as root and I am trying to access the cluster. I'm hitting the endpoint as a user with the keys of AWS and the EKS CLI user. So the next thing is either I give access to my EKS CLI user to access the cluster via roles, or I delete my cluster and created either using the AWS CLI user, or create like a service account and then create the cluster. Okay, so I logged into my Bastion host, which is already a master for my existing on-prem cluster. So if you see, if I do kubectl get nodes, right now it's pointing to my existing cluster, not the on-prem, I'm sorry, the one I set it up myself on the AWS EC2 instances. So I just started the master, and as you can see, it's pointing to that. Now I can change the context and point it to the cluster which is on running on AWS EKS cluster, but my cluster is still creating. So what I did was I did a AWS configure, and I gave my secret key and access key, and I am now, if I run the AWS EKS update kubeconfig, it is going to point to that. So my cluster is still creating. So once it's created and done, let me show you where is my cluster. EKS test. So this cluster is still in creation. So what I did was that I went ahead and I deleted the earlier cluster because I created as an admin account. That was a root account, and I don't, not admin, sorry, root account, and I didn't want to do that. So I went ahead and I created a new user called EKS admin, and I gave the access permission to with the cluster config EKS cluster config role and policy, and I also gave it administrator access. So now when I run my CLI commands, I will be able to access and see the cluster, because now I'm going to add, because this has access, and I'm going to do the add it to the AWS auth. There is a config map that is created, and it should be a part of the AWS auth config map in the cluster. So then so that user should be a part of it. So EKS admin is the user that created the cluster, so it should be able to access. But if my any other user, so I have another user AWS, it is called EKS user CLI. So I will add that user, and I can give restricted privilege. Okay, so my cluster is ready. EKS test, as you see, it's active, and if I go and check it out, it has workloads running on it, the basic system ones. Now I'm going to come back and I want to access it. I will rerun my command to update config. If I do kubectl, I want to see if it did anything. So there are no resources because it does not. So like I was able to see the nodes on my cluster, but the EKS setup, it does not show anything until I add the worker nodes, because the master plane is not even accessible. We have no information on the nodes, no information on the node name or anything. But if I see the services, I should be able to. There's a Kubernetes cluster, the service running, and if I do minus minus all namespaces, then I can see another one running, right? So we have cluster up and ready. With this one was created with EKS admin, not root, and I'm able to access using kubectl. So the next will be I'm going to create my worker. I have to add worker nodes, because if I want to deploy application, I need worker nodes to be running. And right now there is nothing. It's just the manager plane, control plane. So what I'm going to do is I will add to our. So the best way to do is create a node group and then add a node to it. So that way it is good for scaling up and setting up all those policies, and then we can set up the node groups and add that to the cluster as worker node. So that's what I'm going to discuss right now.